0 co-conspirators charged in 1 year. This is what Bondi said when Congress asked why. The binder was on the table before the hearing started. Not a document binder, not a collection of case files or evidentiary exhibits. A binder that Bondi's staff had prepared and placed in front of her containing something different, attack material. Prepared responses designed not to answer the questions Congress was going to ask, but to redirect them. To shift the conversation from what the Department of Justice had or had not done to what the Democrats asking the questions had done or said or failed to do in some prior context that Bondi's staff had cataloged and organized into a physical object that she could open at the witness table and deploy. The hearing room understood what the binder was before she opened it. Congressional hearings have a visual grammar that people who attend them regularly can read. The placement of documents on the witness table, the thickness of preparation materials, the positioning of aides. These are signals about how a witness intends to approach their testimony. A witness who arrives with legal pads and case files is preparing to address the substance. A witness who arrives with a binder organized by committee member names is preparing to address the committee members. Bondi's binder was the second kind. The survivors understood it. They had been in those seats before. They had watched prior hearings. They had watched officials arrive with process language and institutional defenses and careful characterizations of ongoing reviews. They had watched near future become a recurring answer about disclosure timelines. They had watched lawyers explain why the law required withholding documents the law was designed to require releasing. They had not watched an attorney general arrive with a prepared list of personal attacks on the members of Congress who were about to ask about the 0 co-conspirators charged in 1 year of her tenure. 0. That is the number. 1 year as Attorney General of the United States. 0 Epstein co-conspirators indicted. This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. Let's establish the record before the attacks, because the record is what the hearing was about. In 1 year, under Pam Bondi's leadership, the Department of Justice indicted 0 individuals connected to the Epstein sex trafficking network as co-conspirators. This is not a contested figure. It is the documented output of the department she leads. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted before Bondi took office. The lead prosecutor on the Epstein case was fired after Bondi became Attorney General. The timing of that firing. A career prosecutor removed from the most significant sex trafficking case in federal history, was documented and produced no public explanation from the department. In July 2025, the DOJ issued a memo stating there were no more leads to pursue. That memo was issued while a witness statement filed with the FBI's National Threat Operations Center sat in federal files with no investigative follow-up. It took an act of Congress to force even partial release of the Epstein files. A release that, when it came, contained a specific and documented inversion, the personal information of victims, names, phone numbers, addresses, was published while the names of individuals identified as abusers remained redacted and protected. 3 million pages of files remain in federal records, held past the legally mandated deadline for their release. The deadline was set by the legislation Congress passed when the DOJ would not release the files voluntarily. The deadline passed. The files were not released. That is not an ongoing review. It is a violation of a legal obligation. That is the record. 0 indictments, 1 fired prosecutor, a false memo, a partial disclosure that protected abusers and exposed victims, 3 million pages still withheld, and an attorney general who arrived at the hearing room where that record would be presented with a binder full of attacks instead of answers. Bondi arrived at that hearing room with a binder, Rep. Jerry Nadler came with a number. The number was 0. He asked the question directly, how many of Epstein's co-conspirators has she indicted? The question has a specific answer. It is 0. It requires 1 word. Bondi did not provide that word. She began to speak about what the prior administration had done, about Merrick Garland, about the investigations that preceded her tenure. Nadler reclaimed his time. She continued speaking. He reclaimed his time a second time. The chairman intervened. The clock was stopped. Time was formally restored to the member. The specific procedure that governs congressional hearings. When a member reclaims their time, the witness stops speaking. Had to be explained and re-explained. Not because the procedure is complicated, but because Bondi had arrived with a strategy that required her to continue speaking past the reclaim. The reclaim cuts off the non-answer. If she stopped at the reclaim, the record would show only the non-answer. By continuing past it, she could fill the transcript with deflection and force the member to fight for control of their own time. The chairman had to intervene multiple times. At one point, he stopped the clock entirely. At another, he formally restored a member's time. These are not normal features of a cabinet member's congressional testimony. The exchange that produced the phrase, "not even a lawyer," from one of Bondi's allies in the room did not emerge from a legal dispute. It emerged from a procedural one. When a member says, "I reclaim my time," that is a statement that the member's 5-minute clock has been used up by the witness's non-responsive answer, and the member is taking control of the remaining seconds. It is not an invitation for the witness to continue. It is not a pause. It is a stop. Bondi kept talking through it. The chairman had to intervene. The exchange turned chaotic, not because the questions were complicated, but because the witness was refusing to accept the rules of the forum in which she was testifying. Bondi kept talking. The chairman kept intervening. The clock kept stopping. The question was still 0. The clock had stopped. The time had been restored. The number had not changed. Nadler put it plainly when order was restored. You have been the Attorney General for a whole year. Your DOJ fired the lead prosecutor of this case, sat on evidence this entire time, claimed falsely last July that there were no more leads. It took an act of Congress for you to finally release part of the Epstein files. And when you did, you included personal information about the victims while protecting the names of abusers. That is not an accusation assembled from inference. That is a description of documented events. The lead prosecutor was fired. Documented. The memo claiming no more leads was issued. Documented. The partial disclosure that protected abuser names while publishing victim information was produced. Documented. The congressional legislation that forced the partial disclosure was passed because the DOJ had not produced the files voluntarily. Documented. Bondi's response to each element of that documented record was to attack the person presenting it. She brought up Bill Clinton. She brought up Merrick Garland. She asked a member what law school they attended, a question that from the Attorney General of the United States testifying about the 0 co-conspirators her department had charged in 1 year is a statement about her priorities in that room. She read from a list of USAID spending items she was proud to have cut, items that had nothing to do with the Epstein investigation, the fired prosecutor, the victim disclosure, or the 3 million withheld pages. She accused one member of attending events with gang members, an accusation that member immediately disputed as unsubstantiated and for which no documentation was produced in the hearing. She asked another member a question during that member's allotted time, reversing the institutional relationship between witness and questioner in a way that the chairman had to formally address. Each of those actions had a function in the binder strategy. The law school question was designed to undermine the questioner's authority. The USAID spending recitation was designed to fill the questioner's time with material that served Bondi's political narrative. The gang member accusation was designed to shift the discussion to the member's character. Each attack was a substitute for an answer, and the attacks were prepared in advance. The binder was the physical record of that preparation. The survivors sat in that room through all of it. They were in the gallery. They had come, as they had come to prior hearings, because the hearing was about the accountability that the investigation of what was done to them was supposed to produce. They sat still through Bondi's attacks on the Clinton administration, through the USAID spending recitation, through the what law school question, through the gang member accusation. Their presence in that room during those exchanges is itself a document. They were watching the Attorney General of the United States spend her time in a congressional hearing doing everything except addressing the documented record of her department's performance on the investigation most directly relevant to their lives. The record established, the attacks documented. Now, the photographs. Then Rep. Ted Lieu put 2 photographs on the screen. This moment has been documented in prior proceedings, and the record of it is established. Lieu's approach, starting with Prince Andrew to establish a principle before applying it to Trump, is the approach of a former federal prosecutor who builds his evidentiary structure before presenting his conclusion. He confirmed the redaction protocol with Bondi. The victim's face was redacted because the person depicted was a victim. Anyone who patronizes Epstein's sex operation is guilty of a crime under the Federal Victims Trafficking Protection Act. The photographs are evidence of a crime. The July 2025 memo said there was no evidence. Lieu said, "Why did you shut down this investigation last July?" Bondi said she didn't believe Lieu had asked Merrick Garland those questions. Lieu said, "I agree with you," 3 times. Then he said, "But you are in charge." That sequence is the hearing's sharpest exchange about institutional accountability. Every prior failure is acknowledged. Every predecessor's inadequacy is granted. And the person at the witness table is the Attorney General today, not then, now. The prior failures are not a defense. They are a baseline that she has the authority to move beyond and has not moved beyond. Then Lieu moved to Trump. He asked whether there were any underage girls at any party Trump attended with Epstein. Bondi said there was no evidence Donald Trump had committed a crime. She said everyone knew that. She said this was the most transparent presidency, Lieu said. "I believe you just lied under oath." Bondi said, "Don't you ever accuse me of a crime." He showed her the FBI witness statement. The limousine driver, the phone call overheard, the young woman's account, the woman whose death officers at the scene said could not have been a suicide. Nobody at the DOJ interviewed this witness. 7 words, 1 document. No response that addressed the document. The exchange is in the permanent record. The witness statement is in the FBI's files. The DOJ has not interviewed the person who filed it. Lieu's time expired with the document still on the screen and the witness statement still in the record. The hearing moved forward. Rep. Jamie Raskin took a different angle, not the public figures in the files, but the private ones whose names the DOJ had published when it was not supposed to. Rep. Jamie Raskin arrived at a question that shifted the hearing's focus from the public figures in the Epstein files to the specific individuals whose names the DOJ had published when it was not supposed to. He asked, "Do you even know who Chase Mulligan is?" The question was not rhetorical. It was a test of a specific and narrow knowledge that the Attorney General of the United States should possess. Raskin was asking whether Bondi was aware of a specific individual, a private person, not a public figure, whose name had appeared in the DOJ's partial release of the Epstein files in a way it should not have, an individual whose personally identifying information, name, phone number, physical address, had been published by the Department Bondi leads in violation of the federal law that specifically required that information to be withheld. Bondi said he was a good congressman from Kentucky. He was not. Chase Mulligan is not a congressman. Not from Kentucky, not from anywhere. The name belongs to a private individual whose privacy was violated by a federal government release, a name that the head of the department responsible for that release would be expected to know, not because congressional testimony requires encyclopedic knowledge, but because the violation of a private individual's legally protected privacy by the department you lead is the kind of thing that produces a response, a review, a briefing, something. The fact that Bondi did not know the name suggests that either she had not been briefed on the specific victims whose information was improperly released, or she had been briefed and could not recall the details under questioning. The exchange documented 2 things simultaneously. The first, that Bondi did not have command of the details of the disclosure her department had produced. The second, that when she didn't know an answer, her default was to produce a different answer, to fill the space with words that sounded authoritative but didn't address the question. Naming a fictional Kentucky congressman in response to a question about a real private individual whose privacy was violated is not a misunderstanding. It is the binder strategy applied to a question the binder did not contain. The inversion documented in the Epstein file release deserves specific attention because it is the element of Bondi's tenure that most directly affects the people who were in that hearing room. The law governing the Epstein file release authorizes, in fact requires, the redaction of personally identifying information about victims, names, phone numbers, addresses, any information that could identify a person who survived Epstein's trafficking operation. That protection exists because the survivors have a legal right to privacy, because exposure creates safety risks, and because the accountability process should not require victims to sacrifice their anonymity in order to produce transparency about the people who abused them. The partial disclosure that Bondi's DOJ produced did the opposite. The personal information of victims was published. The names of individuals identified as abusers, the people the law was designed to protect victims from, not to protect, were redacted. The protection mechanism was applied to the wrong category of people. Raskin pointed out the specific consequence. Survivors who had made legal decisions about their own participation in public proceedings, about what they would and would not allow to be associated with their identities, on the basis of federal legal protections that guaranteed their names could not be released, now had their names in the public record because the DOJ's release had disregarded those protections. He asked how much those people should receive for the violation of their privacy rights. Bondi said he was obsessed with Donald Trump. That answer is in the same record as the question that produced it, next to the documented violation of victim privacy protections, next to the documented publication of names, phone numbers, and addresses that the law specifically required to be withheld. The binder's function became visible over the course of the hearing as Bondi worked through it. The attacks were not random. They followed a pattern. When asked about Epstein co-conspirators, mentioned the prior administration. When asked about the fired prosecutor, mentioned the Trump impeachments. When asked about the victim disclosure, accused the member of Trump derangement syndrome. When asked about evidence of presidential involvement, declare the most transparent presidency in history and pivot to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Bondi at one point stated that the Dow was over $50,000, a figure that is not how stock market indices are measured, and that produced visible reactions from members and observers in the room. Bondi asked why people were reacting. The Dow Jones Industrial Average does not trade as a 5-digit number. The binder contained a prepared response for each category of question, not an answer to the question. A response designed to shift the conversation away from the documented record and toward a political argument that Bondi believed she could win. The strategy assumed that members would accept the deflection rather than press through it. Most members did not accept it. They reclaimed their time. Bondi kept talking. The chairman intervened. The cycle repeated across multiple members' time allocations. She had an answer for every question. None of the answers addressed the questions. The problem with the strategy was that it worked against the rules of the forum. Congressional hearings have a specific procedural structure. 5 minutes, one question. You answer it. If you don't answer it, the member reclaims their time. When they reclaim their time, you stop speaking. That structure exists because congressional oversight requires that questions receive answers, that the documented record of a hearing contain the actual positions of the people being questioned, not the prepared deflections they would prefer to substitute for those positions. The reclaim is not optional. It is not a pause. It is the procedural mechanism by which Congress enforces its oversight authority against a witness who is using the witness chair as a platform rather than a seat. Bondi treated the reclaim as optional. She treated the 5-minute structure as a platform for her own argument rather than a mechanism for accountability. Rep. Raskin, at one point during his time, stopped and explained the rule directly to her. When we reclaim our time, you stop speaking. You have no choice. It was not the kind of instruction that a former Attorney General of Florida should require from a member of Congress during a federal oversight hearing. But it was the instruction the hearing required. The chairman intervened repeatedly. At one point, he had to stop the clock. At another, he had to formally restore members' time. At another, he had to explicitly remind Bondi that members are permitted to ask questions of each other during the hearing without requiring her participation. The proceedings required management that congressional hearings involving cabinet witnesses do not normally require because cabinet witnesses, whatever their disagreements with the committee, typically understand and follow the basic procedural rules of the forum they are testifying in. Bondi's allies framed her behavior as fighting back. Her critics framed it as obstruction. What the transcript shows is something more specific. A witness who had concluded that answering the questions was more dangerous than not answering them, and who had prepared for the hearing accordingly. When every answer is an attack, the attacks become the answer. At the end of the hearing, after all the attacks and the binder deflections and the Dow Jones reference and the gang member accusation and the what law school question and the deferred time and the chairman's interventions, the question was put simply to the survivors in the room. Had any of them been able to meet with the Department of Justice? Every hand went up. Not some hands. Not a majority. Every hand. Every survivor who had come to that hearing room, who had sat through the exchanges, who had watched the Attorney General deploy her binder against the members asking about their case. Every one of them had been unable to meet with the DOJ. Then the question was asked differently to confirm. Every hand went up again, the same answer from the same people in the same room. 0 meetings, not one. The department responsible for producing accountability for what was done to them had not, in 1 year, met with a single one of the survivors present in that hearing room. That moment. The hands, the silence, the document those hands produced is the hearing's final image. After everything that preceded it, after every deflection and attack and procedural dispute, the hands went up and the answer was 0. That moment. The hands in the air in a federal hearing room is the document that the hearing produced alongside the transcript of every attack and deflection and binder-sourced accusation. 0 co-conspirators, 3 million pages withheld, victims exposed, Abusers protected. And every survivor in the room raising their hand to say they had received nothing from the department they had been waiting on. Bondi spent her time in that hearing room attacking the people asking questions. The survivors spent their time watching. They watched the Attorney General invoke Bill Clinton when asked about Epstein. They watched her mention Merrick Garland when asked about the fired prosecutor. They watched the Dow Jones reference when asked about the stock market non sequitur that produced laughter she did not understand. They watched her ask a member what law school he attended when asked a legal question. They watched the chairman stop the clock. They watched the time get formally restored. They watched the binder get opened and worked through, page by page, attack by attack, across the 5-minute allocations of every member who asked about the documented record of what the DOJ had and had not done in 1 year. At the end of it, every hand in the survivor section went up. 0 meetings with the DOJ. 0 co-conspirators charged. 3 million pages withheld. Victim's name. Abusers protected. 1 lead prosecutor fired. 1 false memo claiming no leads. 1 year. 0 co-conspirators charged in 1 year. She didn't answer. She attacked. That is the record.